The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Long-Term Management of Forest Carbon Projects, our webinar for today. We're just going to wait here for just like one or two more minutes to let more folks sign on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, hi everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webinar, Long-Term Management of Forest Carbon Projects. My name is Sarah Wescott. I'm the Forest Program Manager here at the Climate Action Reserve. Just a little background, the topic for today's webinar Okay, the topic for today's webinar came to us from one of today's speakers, Erika Anderson. We were talking about this idea of some of the different challenges facing forest carbon projects over their 100+ year commitment. And the more we talked about this, the more we realized there was probably a need for some more education in this space. A lot of the market players, including Climate Action Reserve, have been spending a lot of time working to get the program off the ground and make improvements over the short term. But the market has really begun to mature, and especially with some of our older projects, we've seen that lands are starting to change hands, service contracts are ending, and these forests are continuing to grow and be subject to the requirements of the protocol, which brings up a lot of challenges. And with all these variables at play, we wanted to address how landowners can best navigate the requirements of the program while still planning for the future. So before we get into the agenda today, I wanted to mention a few housekeeping points. Everyone is on mute today, so please go ahead and submit any questions you have at any time throughout the presentation through the question box available in the webinar. We are recording today's webinar, and we will be posting it on our website later, and we will also distribute PDFs of the slides afterwards. And we are going to be trying to do a little Q&A after each speaker's section, but we'll also save some more time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So today I will start us off with an introduction of some of the long-term requirements embedded in the Forest Protocol to really tee up the great panel of speakers we have today. And I'll give a more detailed bio of each of our speakers as we go along, but just as a quick overview. We'll have Erika Anderson of Anderson Law Firm addressing the idea of risk over the life of the project, talking through market considerations, reversals, early project termination, invalidation, and things of that nature. From there, we'll go into some of the details of project management. Jim Clark of North Coast Resource Management will talk through the ins and outs of inventory management. Christie Pollet-Young of SCS Global Services will lead us through the verification process and what types of challenges projects may face during ongoing verification. And John Battaglia of BGC Environmental Brokerage Services will talk about future market opportunities and how projects can be thinking about credit sales over the long term. And then lastly, if time allows, I'll close with some potential policy considerations we're looking at to address some of the challenges raised. And again, we'll be saving time for Q&A throughout. So to begin, I'll be highlighting some of the key protocol requirements pertaining to today's discussion and really set the stage for why we've raised this topic. I know a number of folks on the phone are already familiar with us, but for those who are new, the Climate Action Reserve is a private nonprofit carbon offset registry. We develop carbon offset policies and protocols, manage a registry of voluntary projects, and work as an offset project registry for the California Air Resources Board Compliance Cap and Trade Program. To give a little context, I did want to take a moment to highlight some of the different markets we'll be discussing today. As I mentioned, the Climate Action Reserve operates in both the compliance and voluntary offset markets. So I won't dwell on this information for too long, as I think a lot of today's attendees are familiar with these markets, but just to note some of the key differences between the voluntary and compliance markets will affect how projects may choose to be managed in the long term, related to the program standards, cost of participation, credit prices, and availability of buyers. These are all things that will really factor into project management decisions in the long term. For the most part today, though, we'll be focusing on California's compliance offset program, as that has been the strongest offset market for forest projects to date. And just as a note, a lot of the requirements we will be talking about are going to apply to both markets. Regardless of the market we're discussing, there are certain key principles that go into ensuring offset quality. Anyone familiar with an offset program has seen these terms many times, but some of these, particularly the top three, ensuring realness, additionality, and permanence of offset credits, require that we have long-term ongoing monitoring, reporting, and verification of project activities. And in the case of forest projects, we require that these activities continue for 100 years after credit issuance. I've alluded to this a little bit, but to really break down the long-term time commitment that we're talking about for a forest project, we have three main components. The first is the crediting period. So for ARB compliance projects, that's a 25-year minimum crediting period, but that crediting period can be renewed. And then for Climate Action Reserve voluntary projects, we're talking about a 100-year minimum, which again could theoretically be renewed. From there, MRV, which is monitoring, reporting, and verification, continues for 100 years after the last credit is issued. This relates back to that permanence requirement in which projects have to maintain their credits out of the atmosphere for 100 years in order to be considered permanent. On-site standing live carbon must be maintained or increased during the crediting period, and there can be no decreases over any consecutive 10-year period. Again, this is guaranteed through the ongoing MRV, and there are some exceptions to this rule in rare cases, such as the need to mitigate for a risk of wildfire, insect, or disease. But for the most part, projects will be held to this need to maintain or increase carbon stocks. After the crediting period has ended, there can be a decrease as long as the carbon stocks don't end up dipping below the level for which they've already been credited. And that's what is represented here by that blue color. So in that monitoring phase, we can have the carbon stocks dipping up and down as long as they are maintained above that level, which would constitute a reversal. So to talk a little bit more about reversals, if that maintenance or increase of carbon stocks is not accomplished, we have reversals in the protocol. There are two types. We have unavoidable and avoidable reversals. An unavoidable reversal refers to any sort of natural disturbance, such as mortality caused by insects, disease, or wildfire. And the program employs a buffer account to which all projects contribute credits when they go through their verification and credit issuance process. This is based on the risk profile of the project, but is usually between 15 to 20% of the project's credits. The account is shared across the program and acts as an insurance mechanism so that the program can replace credits lost to unavoidable reversals. On the other hand, avoidable reversals are the result of intentional disturbances such as overharvesting, and they are required to be compensated for by the forest owner. Environmental safeguards are another important component of the long-term aspects of forest management. The protocol requires things like diverse species, native species, and maintenance of deadwood. And it is important to make sure that these requirements are communicated when the land is being transacted, as these requirements can all impact how future landowners choose to manage the property. Additionally, it's worth noting that while these requirements apply throughout the entire life of the project, the consequences for falling out of compliance with one of these requirements after the crediting period has ended are not really clearly detailed in the compliance offset protocol. So that is sort of a challenge just in terms of interpreting to what level these requirements need to be maintained once crediting has ended. On the other hand, for the voluntary program, a potential penalty for falling out of requirement with one of these points is that account activity can be suspended. So that is something to keep in mind. Similarly, around the requirements for sustainable harvesting, it's important that these be clearly communicated, particularly if land is being transacted. Most projects choose to meet the sustainable harvesting requirement through third-party certification, like SFI, FSC, or American Tree Farm. However, if the property is being sold, it's important to make sure that a new certificate can be put in place quickly to avoid a lapse in coverage, as that can affect compliance with the requirements of the protocol. Similarly, if the project were to be using a long-term management plan, it's important to consider whether that plan runs with the land and will actually change over to the new ownership if land is transacted, or the project owner needs to be prepared to use one of the other sustainable harvesting options. So now that I've introduced a number of the long-term monitoring concepts for forest projects, I wanted to give mention to some of the reporting requirements. Account access is not exactly the most exciting requirement we'll be talking about today, but it's very important. Kits and registry accounts are how projects can share information with relevant parties, members of the public, and how projects can access and transact their credits. KITS, the Compliance Instrument Tracking System Service, is the Western Climate Initiative account through which projects can hold their compliance offset credits. So if a project's management has changed, or if the project itself changes hands, it's important to make sure that these accounts are up to date. So this can mean opening a new KITS account or changing an account representative. And these processes can take quite a while. So it's important to note that if the offset project operator for a project changes, that this is something that needs to be initiated sooner rather than later. And the regulation has requirements around timing for notifying ARB of updated offset project operators, so that's something to keep in mind as well. And similarly, on the registry side, it's important to make sure that if a project changes hands, that the new entity either has a reserve account or is in the process of opening a new reserve account, so that we can correctly transfer the project over so that documents can be accessed and credits can be transacted as needed. And this will also help avoid any delays with reporting and verification. In addition to making sure all accounts can be accessed, it's important to be mindful of what needs to be submitted in order to meet obligations for ongoing reporting. For ARB, this means the offset project data reports, which you see here on the screen, also referred to as OPDRs. So throughout the life of the project, as projects experience staff turnover, changes in management, or changes in ownership, it's important that there be a clear chain of command for making sure that OPDRs continue to be completed and submitted in a timely manner. ARB's program does not have any flexibility on the OPDR deadline, which is 4 months following the end of the reporting period. So submitting this form even a day late can render an entire reporting period ineligible for crediting. So this is a very important deadline to keep in mind. And these forms also need to be submitted with the oversight of a professional forester. So that's another important detail to keep in mind when considering all of the different players involved in managing the project. And then for the last piece of ongoing MRV, we have verification. Verification can be a complex process, so I've listed out a couple of the verification-related questions that might come up during the life of the project. And again, as a project matures and the parties and individuals involved with project management change, it's important to know when your next verification is required, which verifiers are you going to work with, and who can you work with based on conflict of interest. How long is this process going to take, and what documents do you need to prepare for verification, and how much is it going to cost? So now that we have a high-level picture of what some of the key long-term requirements are for forest projects, I wanted to touch on the wide range of players who are involved or potentially involved in forest projects. I've already alluded to many of these participants, but wanted to make sure that everyone on the webinar today is on the same page in terms of who can be involved, who should be involved, and just the complexities that can arise in managing these different relationships. So we sort of have three buckets here: what goes into creating and managing a project, what goes into receiving credits, and then what goes into selling those credits. So project management will include the landowner, the project developer, and anyone else who assists in maintaining the project inventory, like a forester or inventory management company and cruisers. On the verification side, you have the verification body, and then ultimately an offset project registry who will review the verification reports and issue credits. And for the compliance market, we also have the California Air Resources Board conducting a final review for our box. And then lastly, you need contacts for selling the credits. So this may be an agreement with a project developer, but brokers, exchanges, and other credit sales models may come into play over the life of the project. And again, this is just a really high-level overview, but in general, these are the types of players that are coordinating with one another over the life of the project. And we have speakers coming up representing each of these groups. So hopefully at this point you have a fairly good idea of why we should be caring about the long-term management of forest projects. Forest projects represent a real long-term commitment with long-term MRV, and there are a lot of players involved, which can raise some challenges. For instance, how can landowners minimize risk of unintentionally violating program rules, and how can they avoid problems with the project? What happens if the property is sold to a new owner, and what considerations should be made to keep the transition seamless? How can landowners plan their inventory and verification schedules to maximize success? And where can landowners find new buyers for their credits once existing contracts end? So these are some of the questions we are hoping to discuss today. I will pause, and I don't think we had many questions yet other than whether we will be sharing the presentation. So yes, just to note, this is being recorded. We will post the recording on our website, and we will share the presentation slides with all attendees. Okay, so now I will introduce our next speaker, Erika Anderson of Anderson Law Firm. Erika is based in Berkeley, California, and has been specializing in carbon since 2010. She has clients nationwide and represents a wide range of players in the offset market in matters related to project development and purchase and sale of offset credits. She has worked in both the compliance and voluntary markets on forestry, livestock, and ODS projects. So let me get Erika unmuted.
Thanks, Sarah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. That was an absolutely fantastic tee-off presentation. So I am a transactional attorney, and I work about 80% of what I do is in the carbon markets. Can you go to the next slide, please? When talking about the legal considerations in forest carbon projects, there tends to be a lot of different material to discuss, and it can feel very scattered. So I thought maybe starting with a couple of overarching goals, which are essentially, how do you look at all of the different rules that apply to a forest project in order to make informed decisions about what to do with your land, whether it is considering entering into a new project or evaluating what to do next in an existing project. So I'm going to talk about two main buckets of information. First, market drivers and how those have changed in the new regulatory regime, as well as some of the main areas of concern, and particularly with a lens to thinking about how you can address some of these areas of concern when you're trying to set up for a successful 100-year project life. And particularly, as Sarah pointed out, when you may have lots of different players kind of coming in and out of the project. Okay, next slide. So just a few cap and trade basics. The reason that we're talking about forest offsets at all is that there's a market for it, and that market that I'm going to be talking about is the California compliance market, and it exists because California requires that its major industrial facilities retire compliance instruments equal to their annual emissions. And right now, those compliance instruments take two forms: allowances and offsets. Allowances are essentially permits to emit carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent. They come into the market in two primary ways. Some are allocated to the covered entities, which basically means that they are given to those industrial facilities, and they come to market through quarterly auctions. The most important thing to know about the auctions is that the Air Resources Board has set a floor price, which is adjusted for inflation, and John will talk about those prices a little bit later on in the webinar. Offsets are entered into through participants who are voluntarily participating in the market. They're almost always traded over the counter, although there have been a few exchange-traded products that are offered. And they typically are discounted from the allowance price due to the risks that are inherent in offset projects. Pricing is, of course, related to supply, and supply is subject to many factors. In addition, offsets are subject to usage limitations, which have changed in the new regulation that was effective April 1st, 2019. Next slide. When considering offset supply and demand, there are several different drivers. The first is offsets that have already been issued but not yet used. So that's the inventory of existing offsets. Existing project tails relating to forest projects that have issued their initial tranche but are going to continue issuing what I call a tail over the 25-year issuing period. New projects that are coming online, as well as new offset types that might be admitted into the program. You also want to look at demand. So who's buying offsets and how many can they purchase? You would want to consider the price to risk considerations that a buyer may be looking at, increased transaction costs because they're traded primarily in bespoke over-the-counter transactions, as well as any usage limitations. In the initial period of the regulation, covered entities were allowed to retire up to 8% of their annual requirements using offsets. Starting in 2021, those usage limits are going to go down. And in addition, 50% of the offsets that are being used must have direct in-state environmental benefits, or DEBs. Next slide. So here's a little chart that shows these offset usage limits. You can see that in the first through third compliance periods, the entities could use up to 8% of offsets. That's going to change in 2021 when that percentage use is going to go down to 4% for 5 years. In addition, what's not shown on this slide is of that 4%, 50% need to have direct environmental benefits in the state of California. Starting in 2026, for the very end of the fifth compliance period, the number, that cap is going to raise to 6%, but again, the 50% DEBs requirement is going to apply. Next slide. So what exactly is a direct environmental benefit? So according to the regulation, it refers to the reduction or avoidance of emissions of any air pollutant in the state or the reduction or avoidance of any pollutant that could have an adverse impact on waters of the state. I'm not sure I know what that means. Well, so the new regulation has specified that projects located within California definitely provide DEBs. Projects outside of California may submit evidence like scientific peer-reviewed papers or government reports or other analyses or data that show either a reduction or avoidance of an air pollutant that's not included in the protocol calculations or avoidance of a pollutant that could have adverse impact on waters of the state. New projects must submit the information at listing, and existing out-of-state projects may submit information by December 31st, 2021 to be recognized as providing DEBs. Now, buried in this little piece of statutory language is kind of a little gotcha, which means that existing out-of-state projects are now going to be subject to that DEBs requirement. Next slide, please. So, points to ponder. What's going to happen to offset markets after 2020? Will they be oversupplied based on the lowered cap? Will markets treat out-of-state offsets differently? And if they're going to treat it differently, when is this price signal going to start to be felt? Is there a point at which the existing forest project tails are going to overwhelm the out-of-state market, particularly with some of the larger projects in Alaska? And so finally, how does this impact your decisions whether or not to do a project, or decisions about when to stop issuing and begin monitoring? Next slide. You'll notice it's a lot of questions and no answers. I have my opinions on those, but I'll be interested to hear what the other speakers think about them as well. So now we're moving into the second part of the talk, which are areas for consideration. And generally, and especially when setting up the contracts for the relationships that are going to affect project participants in the next 100 years. So we're going to talk generally about reversal, early project termination, restrictions on sale and use, environmental health and safety violations, and invalidation. Next slide, please. So Sarah has teed up what a reversal is. That's essentially a carbon loss. And under the regulatory scheme, we have unintentional and intentional reversals. The unintentional reversals are essentially those acts of God, which are made whole through a buffer. And the intentional are defined as losses of carbon relating to the negligence, gross negligence, or willful intent of a project participant. The rule is that in that case, the forest owners must replace the offsets equal to the reduction. In addition, with both types of reversals, it's possible that if the carbon stocks dip below the baseline, there will be an early project termination. For an intentional reversal, no new project can be done on the land, and the forest owners, depending on when it occurs, have to replace up to 150% of all of the issued offsets. Now, this 140% applies only for improved forest management or IFM projects, so not to reforestation projects or avoided conversion projects. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about early project termination, which is related both to the issue of reversal and to the acts of the project participants. A project can automatically terminate first if a reversal reduces carbon below the baseline, or if the offset project operator chooses not to report data and undergo verification at the required intervals. So that's every 6 years for the verification and an inventory every 12 years. It can also occur if title transfers to and the new owner doesn't take on the carbon commitments. Projects can be voluntarily terminated if the participants simply want to walk away. And then, as we discussed on the last slide, for any termination other than an unintentional reversal, forest owners need to replace one offset for all offsets issued to the project. And for IFM during the first 50 years, all offsets issued to the project times a multiplier that starts at 140% and decreases to 100% at 50 years. The general rule, except for unintentional reversals, is that no new projects are permitted on the land. Next slide, please. So why do we worry about reversal worry points? Well, the things I worry about is that really anyone can cause a reversal. Anyone on the land can cause a reversal. And particularly because the Air Resources Board has drawn the line for an intentional reversal at negligence, gross negligence, or willful misconduct. What is going to constitute negligence? And is it going to be determined by the Air Resources Board, or is it going to be determined by the laws of the state in which the project lays? We haven't had an opportunity to see how that's going to be interpreted, but it's certainly something I worry about. In addition, under the regulation, all forest owners have what's called joint and several liability for reversals, which means that anybody who has an ownership interest in the land could possibly be responsible for replacing those offsets. And the definition of a forest owner is really broad. It's anybody with an interest in the real property, and it includes landowners, primary holders of conservation easements, timber rights holders, and subsurface mineral rights holders. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about restrictions on use during the project life. Remember that the commitment is simply to maintain the carbon, and that means that harvesting and working the land is permitted as long as it doesn't deplete the carbon. Other activities are permitted as well, so other sort of complementary uses are permitted on the land, again, as long as they don't decrease the carbon stocks. However, before considering undertaking other uses of the land, you want to consider whether it's going to increase the risks of perhaps violating an applicable law, or if multiple parties are involved, how are you going to enter into contractual relationships that fairly allocate the risks that are associated with that activity. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about restrictions on transfer. Just as you're allowed to use your land however you want, you can also transfer it during the project life. However, the new owner needs to take on all of the project commitments. ARB has specified that the responsibility lies with the new owners, not the old owners. But then it raises questions of, well, so you have essentially these obligations to do the annual MRV and to certain types of stewardship of the land. And how should those obligations and risks be priced into the sale of property? There also are issues if there are multiple forest owners, that all owners are liable for the project, but if one owner leaves the project and the obligations don't pass with that parcel of land, the project may terminate, affecting all of the other owners of the land. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about something entirely different, which I refer to as an EHS violation. So the regulation requires that the offset project activity and implementation of the offset project be in accordance with all local, state, or national environmental health and safety laws and regulations during each reporting period for which offsets are issued. If a project is not in compliance with all EHS laws, no offsets will be issued for the time period in which the project is out of compliance. If an EHS violation existed but was not disclosed, the offsets that have been issued can be invalidated. Now, the old rule was that all offsets from the reporting period in which the violation occurred would be invalidated, but in the new regulation, they've actually tweaked that a little bit, and they will invalidate offsets from the time period in which the violation was occurring. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, the statutory language is really vague, and it raises the question of, well, what types of activities and what types of violations could be considered to be an EHS violation? Fortunately, ARB has given us a little bit of guidance, and they say that they're essentially the activities that impact the carbon stocks. It includes anything related to site preparation, planting, harvesting, and monitoring, but excludes transportation of logs to mills, mill operations, and landfilling. In addition, there's some vagary about what actually constitutes a violation, and the breadth, the scope of what could be a possible violation is quite broad. The new version of the regulation gives a little bit of additional specificity about what might be considered a violation and when it starts and when it may end, and I would refer you to the relevant sections of the regulation. Next slide, please. EHS violations are also related to invalidation. So an invalidation can occur if an EHS violation is later disclosed or discovered, or if there's a material misstatement of the number of offset defined as a greater than 5% overstatement, or if double dipping or fraud, and that's essentially where offsets are issued for the same GHG reductions under another program. Now, I tend to not worry about double dipping very much because that's a risk that's really easy to control. With respect to the other two, I tend to look at it through the lens of, well, who could make these mistakes and how shall these risks be allocated fairly amongst the project participants? So offsets can be invalidated for up to 8 years from the date of issuance. This can be reduced to 3 years if a subsequent OPDR is verified by a different verification body. It goes without saying that once the relevant period has passed, offsets can no longer be invalidated. The rule is that whoever owns the offset at the time that it's invalidated suffers the risk, so we refer to this as the buyer liability rule. Next slide, please. So how do you deal with that invalidation? Although there is the buyer liability rule, that doesn't change the fact that that invalidation risk can be allocated either amongst the various players in contract or that claims may exist in tort, such as negligence or fraud. How do people deal with it? Many projects reduce that invalidation period from 8 years to 3 years. The market has come up with a variety of different pricing schemes to address the risks that are associated with the invalidation periods of offsets. There are insurance products that are available on the market, but I think the main point is that these are risks that need to be discussed, understood, and then allocated amongst the various project participants when they're contracting with each other. So that might be between the OPO and the APD, or the APD and some of its service providers, or the seller and the buyer of the credits. Next slide, please. So I think on this slide, I'm just going to talk about the very last bit, which is how do you negotiate these risks and how do you fairly allocate them? And you really, I take an approach of looking at all of the relationships of all of the project participants and trying to consider who might be responsible for making the mistake that leads to invalidation. Is it a forest owner for failing to give accurate information, or the OPO for failing to give accurate information? Is it the APD for making a material mistake or choosing to not disclose something to the registry or the Air Resources Board? What types of limitations of liability are you going to negotiate in your contracts? Is anybody going to have an indemnification obligation or an obligation not to take on invalidation risk in a forward sale of a contract? What types of mistakes are going to create liability? Is an innocent mistake going to be treated differently from negligence versus gross negligence? And finally, making sure that everybody who's involved in the process of generating the offset carries correct errors and omissions policies. Next slide. So that's about all I wanted to say today about risk management on offsets, and I'd be happy to take any questions if we have time.
Great, thank you, Erika. We did receive one question, although I think it came in right before your presentation, so I think you answered it well, but I think it bears repeating. So aside from losing account access, what penalties are there if and when a new owner completely reverses the project gains by removing the trees or developing homes or the like? Do you mind sort of repeating your takeaway on early project termination?
Sure. That would be an early project termination. It would depend on which bucket it fell into, whether it was a reversal leading to early project termination or somebody leaving the land, but the penalty would be, depending on the forest type, either 100% replacement of the offsets that have been issued, or if it was an IFM project, up to 140% of the issued offsets. But the liability would lay the new owner.
Okay, thanks, Erika. I think that is all the questions we have for now. And again, feel free to submit your questions anytime, and we'll try to address them at the end of each speaker, but we also have time at the end of today's webinar. So next we have Jim Clark of North Coast Resource Management. North Coast Resource Management provides a broad range of environmental services ranging from traditional forestry and land management to conservation-based land management. Jim has been practicing forestry since 1992 and has been working on the development of both voluntary and compliance carbon offset projects in the North Coast of California since 2008. North Coast Resource Management has developed 11 improved forest management carbon projects across 140,000 acres and brought over 10 million carbon offsets to market. All right, Jim.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah. Can you just advance to my topic slide? Well, great. So, yeah, in my discussion here, I'm going to talk about technical project management needs centered around inventory management and how that's handled over the crediting period and also during the monitoring or reporting period once the crediting period has ended. It's going to be a fairly high-level discussion. It's easy to get down into the weeds when you're talking about inventory and inventory design. So try to just keep it at a high level. I think if people have questions, more specific, we can cover those at the end of my talk or at the end of the entire presentation. Next slide, please. All right, so inventory design. Basic point here is that carbon project inventory design is similar to traditional forestry inventory design, although it's really kind of under a microscope. So everything is kind of done at a very high level and with very stringent tests on statistical soundness of the inventory, because that statistical design will be reviewed by ARB/reserve and the verification body during the project's initial verification and throughout the life of the project as the inventory is updated. That's going to be a constant subject of review. Is the inventory design being implemented properly, and does it continue to remain statistically sound? So I mean, traditional designs for carbon project inventories are you take different forms. Systematic samples where you have a plot design that is systematically applied across the project type, or systematic design with a random component where you're randomly selecting systematically identified plots. Those are traditional designs, and then this third item here on the list under item 1 is the standardized approach, which really is referring to tools such as the Climate Action Reserve Standardized Inventory Methodology, which is it's a methodology that project developers and landowners can use for reserve projects, and it's designed to create a framework for solid inventory design, but also to reduce the cost of that inventory by clearly identifying how the methodology is to be employed and actually providing some tools, standardized tools for calculating carbon stock. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into that, but that kind of is a highlight. That's a highlight of a difference between, say, a compliance project where you basically can do whatever you want as long as the inventory is statistically sound. Whereas if you work with a voluntary project under the reserve, you have other options. You have a little bit more flexibility. You can do the same thing you would have done under a compliance project, but you'd also use a standardized methodology if you desired. And again, basic difference between compliance and voluntary programs is that voluntary programs are a little bit more flexible in what people can do, and they kind of designed to reduce barriers and bring more people into the carbon market. The basic tenet of any carbon inventory is that the data can't be more than 12 years old, which creates a minimum re-inventory schedule. So every 12 years you need to refresh your inventory, or basically you can't have any plot in your inventory that's over 12 years old. You can have a mix of plot ages, they just can't be older than 12 years. Another key tenet of an inventory design is that it must be replicable by the verification body. The verification body is going to be testing your inventory over time during each site visit verification. And that requires a well-documented inventory design so that the verifier can replicate your measurements and they can understand how you took them and ideally take the same measurements. And it generally requires plots to be monumented so that they can be relocated. They don't have to be monumented, but it certainly helps in the verification if they are. It tends to lead to a more favorable outcome. And then the fourth tenet of carbon inventory is the plot measurements are taken at a very high standard, DVH to the nearest tenth of an inch, total height to the nearest foot. Practices like subsampling for tree heights are generally not done because they introduce variability at the plot level. And the test of the inventory occurs at the plot level. It includes overall straight averages, but it's basically a plot level test between the verifier's collected data and the project data for that plot. And when you start introducing subsampling of heights, which works really well at the project level, it doesn't always work at the plot level just because of site-specific characteristics of where that plot might be. It might be on a higher site or have more water, and therefore the trees are going to be growing slightly differently than the average across the property. So how about next plot, Sarah? Our next, here we go, not plot, next slide. All right, so carbon project inventories are very technically involved, therefore they're more expensive than a traditional forest inventory. Traditional forest inventories primarily focus on merchantable trees, conifers, or if you're back east, maybe specific hardwoods that are marketable. Whereas in a carbon project, you're required to, measure all tree species and report those volumes. So you're required to measure much smaller trees and also trees of all species, all tree species. And also inventory confidence levels built into the protocols are at a high level. It's plus or minus 5% at the 90% confidence level, which is a very rigorous industry. It's more rigorous than the industry standard, which is usually a plus or minus 10% at 95% confidence. So you're having to produce a very rigorous inventory, which requires more plots than if those standards were slightly more relaxed. And then all of that leads to this inventory test during verification. Is the statistical test designed to identify differences between the project data and the data collected by the verifier. And like I said, that's conducted at the plot level, and it's very rigorous. And things that happen on plots, such as trees dying or trees falling over, those can throw the plot, the test out of whack, and generally just require additional plots to be installed before the test is satisfied. And that that just leads to more cost during verification. And I'll touch on some of the when I talk about different approaches to re-inventory, that'll be key thing that I'll be talking about is how do you design that re-inventory so that you can minimize risk of not being successfully verified. And again, I'll point out here this last point: standardized designs can lead to reduced inventory costs. And generally, that's just if you look at the reserve standardized inventory methodology, which is available on their website under forest project protocols, that's a good place to start. It's also a good place to look to just kind of see how a carbon project inventory might be designed. The reserve tried to incorporate, or they did incorporate, all of the key elements that they've witnessed over time coming up as issues during during verifications and inventory management issues. So they've done a good job in putting that together, and it's a good reference. How about next slide? So in addition to inventory design, a significant component of any, kind of ongoing inventory management and, management of the inventory is the data management. And this is something that will be reviewed during verification. The verifier is going to want to make sure that your data management is consistent and documented from the field to the inventory database and then into the actual carbon stock calculations. And basically, they're wanting to ensure that you have good systems in place to manage the data, so that when you calculate and report that you're not introducing error just because your data management systems are not robust. And this comes down to tracking revisions to plot data and modifications to the inventory design. Those all must be documented year to year as you report your stocks under the protocol, either voluntary or compliance. That's a requirement. It's just to maintain a log of what's changed and why you changed it. And that kind of comes back to, one thing I didn't touch on the last 2 slides ago was, existing projects already have an inventory design, and generally you're going to follow that design, but there's the possibility to modify your design, which you might want to do if you're having trouble with certain aspects of your methodology. And that's allowed. However, it has to be reviewed by the registry or ARB, the Air Resources Board, and the verifier. So there's a component of kind of getting some guidance from them as to whether or not the changes that you're proposing are reasonable and make sense. So another part of data management is that every project, there's lots of different project developers. They all have specialized data processing tools that are required in order to calculate carbon stocks. When it comes to ongoing project management, that's a concern because they may not want to share that tool with your the new firm that you've hired to manage your data and manage your inventory once you're outside of a contract. So that's a potential hiccup at some point, and you may have to change data processing tools, which could result in some review during verification, where the new verifier is going to need to look at those new tools and how they relate and whether they calculate in the same way as the previous data processing that used on the project. And again, here I'll touch back on standardized data processing tools such as the reserve standardized inventory methodology. That's an option, and if you use those standardized tools, that can reduce this last item I was talking about, because you're going to just be using a tool provided by the reserve and managed by the reserve, and that might be a good idea. Just really depends on the project and whether it's compliance or voluntary. All right, how about the next slide, please? All right, re-inventory cycles. So again, generally verification cycles dictate the re-inventory cycle because you're always wanting to have, reliable data when it comes to, the performing of the verification test of your data. So a 12-year remeasurement schedule may not be practical given, a 6-year minimum verification schedule. However, depending on how you're modeling the data and how you're growing it forward, it may be possible to perform, a 6-year verification in the middle of the 12-year period, and you're most likely going to pass, but maybe with a few more plots in order to capture, unforeseen changes at the plot level, such as mortality. And I'll say this, that the primary error that we find when it comes to verification plot testing is cruiser error. So that's the main error that we deal with when it comes to plots not passing. So and it's possible to reduce that error, but impossible to remove it entirely. So it's just an ongoing issue with all forest inventories, whether they're for carbon or not. So one way to manage the re-inventory cycle is to move to a continuous forest inventory, which can reduce the potential for issues during site visit verifications because your data is not entirely refreshed, but always kind of being refreshed. And something like a 10-year rotation through the plots, that can work, because every 6-year verification, you're going to have at least half of your inventory that's fresher than the other half, and that has the potential to not only capture changes in your carbon stocks, which are important, for things that the model, like growth and yield model, can't accurately depict, like mortality or some sort of change in the stand due to, say, wind throw or disease. So those things would be captured through some sort of continuous forest inventory that rotates through the plots, and also spreads the cost of that inventory over time instead of concentrating it, say, every 12 years. And again, that cost of re-inventory must be weighed against potential increased verification costs, and also potential risks of say the model not properly predicting stand growth on a plot or at the project level. And a couple items here that aren't on the slide that you're seeing is that stand management activities will also drive inventory updates. So if the project has ongoing harvesting, well, that's going to drive inventory updates, because that harvesting has to be captured in the inventory. Therefore, new plots have to be installed to capture that change. And then annual inventory updates, which are basically, they're required by the protocols. You have to report your stocks every year. So that's going to generally include modeling plot data with the growth and yield model, and then adjusting for any harvest or disturbances. That's kind of it's not necessarily part of the re-inventory cycle, but it's part of the ongoing monitoring and reporting requirements of the protocol. That has to happen anyways, and there's different ways to handle that as well. Next slide, please. Okay, data retention. This is just a minor point, but it's not minor, but all data used in the carbon stock inventory, the baseline modeling, carbon reporting, it must be retained for a minimum of 15 years. So, again, this comes back to good data management systems and data retention. That all has to be at the key component of any inventory methodology. It's not just how you take the plot, but it's how you manage the data and how you retain it, so that you can maintain a record of all of the data used during every reporting period for the project for a period of time. Okay. Next slide, Sarah. Okay, ongoing inventory. So this is just kind of talking about once the project's crediting period has ended and you're not seeking additional offsets to be issued to the project, now you're just in a monitoring mode where the purpose is to demonstrate that the carbon stocks have not declined below the last credited stock issuance. So the compliance offset protocol allows for extended verification cycles following a non-renewal of the crediting period. And basically what that does is it allows you to stretch out the verifications to a 12-year cycle, which aligns well with the 12-year inventory minimum stand age or plot age. So that's one option there. With voluntary projects, the crediting period's 100 years long, so that's not really an issue, or it's not really a possibility to do that extension. There are a couple caveats there. In order to lengthen your verification for that 12-year cycle, you have to show that your stocks have increased by a certain percentage. I think it's 10% above your last credited stocks. And so as long as you've done that, then you're eligible to extend it. And again, and one other thing in terms of ongoing inventory is that, inventory methodologies are going to change over time, and new technologies are going to become available. Better remote sensing, LiDAR, all of these kind of improved forest measurement tools. And, I think that has the potential to lower ongoing inventory costs, but with the caveat that any changes to the inventory methodology, are going to require approval from ARB, the reserve, and some input from the verification body. And certainly any very complex changes would have the potential to, create a situation where you've changed it so much that, that the verifier or ARB is not comfortable with the revised methodology. So those are all just things to consider. And with that, I suppose we could open it up to some questions, Sarah, if anyone has any questions.
Great, thanks, Jim.
You bet.
We did receive one question, but kind of going back to the idea of reversals. Okay. You can answer that now. So in the case of a reversal where a forest owner has to replace offsets equal to or a multiplier of the reduction, do those replacement offsets have to come from the same protocol type, in this case a forest carbon offset, or can those replacement offsets be a different protocol type? I can take the question, I guess, because we have different answers for the voluntary market and for the compliance market. So under the compliance market, that question is governed by the cap and trade regulation, which requires that a valid compliance instrument be used. So that could be an ARB offset credit, that could potentially be an allowance. Given that allowance prices are higher, I don't think someone would want to go that route, but technically that would be possible. And then for the voluntary market, our forest protocol requires forest credits be used if they're available. If for whatever reason forest credits can't be obtained, then we prefer other land use credit types. And then if for whatever reason those credits are not available, that would be something like credits from a grassland project or an urban forest project, then other CRTs could be used. So there's sort of a tiered approach. And then Jim, we have a question for you. Do you use variable radius plots at monumented plot centers as an inventory technique for voluntary projects?
I don't. I think it could be used. The problem with variable radius plots, in my opinion, is that in terms of replicating measurements over time, they don't necessarily lend themselves to updating the same way that a fixed area plot would. I mean, if your intention is to refresh them more frequently, then I think they would be more applicable. But I think there's some issues there going forward with variable radius plots. They're certainly cheaper to put in, but they just don't lend themselves to kind of like a continuous forest inventory design.
Great, thanks. Jim, another question for you. Are prism plots used or allowed?
Yeah, I would go back to that, the same answer as the last answer, prism plot or a variable radius plot. They're certainly allowed. I mean, that's a valid inventory methodology. I just think that, again, that, for the level of review and the method by which these plots are tested during verification, that variable radius or prism plots just don't lend themselves to, to that ongoing continuous forest remeasurement design. And also, it certainly depends on the forest type. If you have really big trees scattered through your forest, then a variable radius plot has the the risk of missing a very large tree that can be a very far distance from the plot center, and that that in itself is an inventory design issue. It works better in similarly sized stands, and I mean, it can be very efficient in terms of remeasurement or measuring, but it's an ongoing measurement, and comparing growth and yield on those plots and to what's out there. I think there's some issues there.
All right, thank you, Jim. Okay, so next up, Christie Pollet-Young will be speaking about ongoing verification requirements. Christie is the Director of Greenhouse Gas Verification for SCS. She is also a lead auditor with SCS who has participated in the assessment of over 50 forest carbon offset projects around the globe under numerous greenhouse gas accounting standards, including the Climate Action Reserve, the Verified Carbon Standard, and the California Air Resources Board Cap and Trade Program.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the introduction. Could you go to the next slide, please? So here's an overview of my presentation. So essentially why SCS is awesome, the verification process, verification cost and timing, and then the last and most exciting thing for a lot of folks is the keys to verification success. Next slide, please. So a quick overview about SCS. We're an environmental leader in third-party certification for sustainability and environmental standards. So one really great thing is we're a benefit corporation who promotes the development of a world according to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So we are a mission-based organization with over 35 years of experience. For the forestry folks, we do Forest Stewardship Council certification, and then for other folks, we'll do things like fair trade, organics, non-GMO, and recycled content of office furniture and other things. Next slide. So the SCS Greenhouse Gas Verification Program is one of the first to receive accreditation in 2009. We are the world's leading verifier of forest carbon offsets. We've verified over 220 million tons, which is double that of the California Air Resources Board. We verified over 160 projects, and we have expertise in both the cap and trade program and voluntary markets, as you will see on the next slide. So here's just the host of the standards that we work with, and then if you click, Sarah, we will circle the Air Resources Board to show that that's what we're talking about today. Next slide, please. So our experience, we wanted to let you know that not all verifications are the same. One thing that we realize is that's really important is experience, expertise, established relationships, reputation, and integrity. So you can see in blue why we think we meet all of those criteria. I'm happy to speak to you in more detail about those things. But then this last little bit made me laugh because we are with Erika Anderson and all those lawyers. We want to make those folks happy because we want folks to know that if SCS is working on your verification, you have the assurance, and buyers too, buyers, OPO, APD, all the folks involved, none of our verification decisions have been overturned, and we stand by all of our audits. Next slide. So here's just a list of our projects, 44 of the ARB ones. We went from most tons to tiniest, but they're all important and they all have the same set of requirements. Next slide, please. And you can see that's over 55% of the assessments and over 125 million tons. Some are still in the queue, so not all of them are issued, but we have verified them. Next slide. So the question before we even get started is, why do we need verification? I think it's really important to understand what we're doing, and we're not just persnickety people with a clipboard. We want to make sure that the integrity of the environmental claim is there. Like Sarah discussed, all of those things about being real and transparent and verifiable, all those things are important to make sure that this market and this project has credibility. So we are interested in the long term, and we want to make sure the integrity of the carbon market stays there. We also need to provide independence. We are the folks that are looking to make sure that you guys met all the rules and that everyone, the market, the buyers, they don't need to do their own work, because we are taking this role in concert with the Offset Project Registry and the ARB to reduce risk and liability and to make sure that this whole wonderful climate solution continues because we did our part by ensuring the integrity of your project. Next slide. So how do we do that? It's really simple. We just need evidence. We need to make sure that you did everything right. So it's seeing it on a site visit when we do reconnaissance, hearing it by talking to you guys, understanding how you do things, and then recalculating it. So it's really actually simple, that you guys do a great job, and then we check our boxes to make sure that we saw that and agree with that. So next slide. So here is verification milestones, and I'm going to be speaking in more detail about them, but you can see that I actually forgot some because my role, I kind of come in where we're contracting for the verification and we begin scheduling, but as Sarah and Erika and Jim discussed, you are definitely creating your kits account, you're getting things up to speed, you're doing your project development, getting the inventory, making sure your lawyers are happy, getting your folks, your funding and your deals in place. So by the time you come to me, we want to make sure, and this is really wonderful to do before the end of the reporting period, so we can get all of our ducks in a row and schedule exactly, you know, when we want to start things, when you need to finish. Say you have a buyer that wants to purchase tons by a certain date, you need to calculate what you think the ARB review time is going to be, as well as the OPR, but just creating with us a schedule of when you will be able to provide documents, when we should go on site, and when you would like us to finish. And then we can even get into the granular, we need to do, you know, X stage, any of these milestones by X date. So that's really important to really get the contracting and the scheduling done in the beginning. And then we do our best to keep with those timelines. So another part of that is the notice of verification services and conflict of interest paperwork, which has very specific timing requirements according to the regulation. And we really encourage and like to have all of the contracting done and just scheduling done 60 days before the site visit so that we can make sure that we are approved to go on site. Then we'll have a kickoff meeting and make sure that we're all on the same page. There's been no changes to any of the timelines, the desk review, a site visit, the quantitative and modeling review, and then the fun part, when everything's done, we write a report and statement, and then you're on the road to credit issuance. Next slide, please. Oh, this is very important. Verifiers cannot consult for the same project that they verify. You can't ask us when we're doing the verification, you know, we're having a problem with the statistics. Can you tell us, you know, what estimator to use? That's where your technical consultants come in. So we can tell you, you know, what's not in conformance, but we can't tell you how to fix things. Next slide. So this is something that I think folks might skip this part of the regulation. It's not necessarily my favorite, 95979, but it's extremely important. So there's a section with a whole host of things that create a high conflict of interest. So this is, you know, before we even get started, I want to point out some things that come up, which is within the last 5 years, a verification team member cannot have received payment from the OPO, the APD, or the technical consultant for these areas. So things that come up are the development of a forest managed plan, a timber harvest plan, any cruising activities, an appraisal, promoting or selling offsets, and then so many more things. So check out that section. There's a lot of things. Feel free to ask us, contact your OPR, or the ARB if you're uncertain. But these are the things that we need to figure out in the beginning, and that's why we ask for the 60-day notice before the site visit in case there's a question from someone saying, oh, what about this team member? What about X, Y, or Z? Then we could sort it out to make sure that we don't put into jeopardy or push back any of the timelines that we already established. So next slide. So I quickly wanted to go through some scenarios just to really bring it home, this conflict of interest and how important it is for us to maintain independence. So Sam Cruz timber marked trees for Happy Trees, the OPO, in September 2015 for 1.5 days for a fee of $1,500. They have not worked for Happy Trees since. Can SAM conduct sequential sampling cruising for grumpy verifiers, the verifier, for a Happy Trees project? Sarah, can you click the button? So no, SAM received payment from the OPO Happy Trees within 5 years. The small value is irrelevant. Next scenario, please. Alex works for Database Gurus until Thanksgiving 2014, but then wants to join Grumpy Verifiers, Inc. as an auditor for a Happy Trees carbon project where Database Gurus is the technical consultant. Can Alex be on the team? No, Alex received payment from the technical consultant Database Gurus within the past 5 years. And finally, the last scenario. Leslie was a cruiser for a Happy Trees carbon project for RP1 with Grumpy Verifiers, but then became a lead verifier for persnickety verifiers and would like to conduct the full verification for RP2, an invalidation audit to convert RP1 CCO8s to CCO3s. Oops, I forgot that. Can Leslie be a member of the RP2 team? Sarah, what's the answer? No, the verification team, not just the verification body, for full verification must be completely new. Otherwise, you are evaluating your own work, and that is a COI. Okay, so now that we've passed the verification, the COI, the paperwork's been approved, we had the kickoff meeting, here is the desk review. And this is where we review your OPDR, we identify fatal flaws, any questions, or issues and concerns. We develop an audit plan for the site visit, and we green light the site visit. We've definitely stopped here at this process, realizing that the inventory isn't sound or there's a fundamental issue. You don't own the land, or you measured DBH at the root collar. We just won't go because we're not going to waste your time. We also select sample plots, we'll discuss safety and access, and then we'll issue findings that are related to things like eligibility or forest management. Next slide. Site visit, this usually starts with an office meeting. We'll discuss the verification criteria, the ownership, management activities, interview relevant personnel, meet your local forester, other folks, prepare for site reconnaissance later in the visit. Next slide. So the site visit. So I know everyone thinks about the sequential sampling, and yes, that is a really big deal. We will have pre-selected inventory plots for remeasurement. We always appreciate very much when the on-site personnel helps us to facilitate getting to those plots, providing the access, finding the best, most efficient way to get to the most number of plots during a reasonable working day. And I say reasonable because, Alaska has lots of sunlight in the summer, so we don't necessarily need to take advantage of all of it. So we'll definitely make sure that we work with you to be efficient in our sequential sampling. And this is really important because we've seen that logistics can be really challenging related to access. Sometimes there's a fantastic road network. Sometimes there isn't. Sometimes there are people with firearms in the middle of the woods or illegal activities. We need to know about that. We need to work with you. And also we understand there's limitations when there's helicopter access. So again, communication and planning for the site visit is essential. So besides remeasuring plots, getting to plots and remeasuring them, we also want to ensure that you guys are following your inventory protocol and your folks are trained and understand how to conduct the inventory. And this comes up if there's irregular trees or situations that are just outside the normal. We want to make sure that your cruisers have been trained in that. We also do site reconnaissance. We look at your silviculture. We look at the management activities, things that just look like this is what you planned in your growth and yield modeling. We'll look at project boundaries. We'll again talk to folks that are on site, folks that worked on your project installing the inventory or doing management. And then at the end of it all, we will issue findings of more information or things that are not in conformance. Next slide. So, we like to do a stepwise approach. After that, we feel like everything is good to go. We will take a look at the quantitative and modeling portions of your OPDR, to get to the fact of if your GHG assertion, your RBARCS calculation is correct. So sometimes we do this on site, sometimes we do this via webinar, but this is where we really get into a recalculation and review of how you've analyzed your data and how you're managing and storing it. So from this portion, we'll also issue findings if we have any questions. Next slide. So after the site visit, we'll also do the very important environmental health and safety checks, additional ownership checks, review and close findings. This is where it generally takes a little bit of time. I think, in an ideal world, your project would be perfect and well explained, and we just followed everything quickly, and there would be no findings, but generally there are, and this is where the timing can expand. And that's just, this is where communication is really important between the verifiers, project personnel, just about meeting timelines and making sure that we're, working towards finishing by an OVS deadline or by when you need to sell credit. So communication and adhering to timelines is super important. Next slide. So congratulations, your project's findings are closed, and this is where we develop a documentation package for the review for the offset project registry and the ARB, just so they understand everything we did. I know that we put a lot of emphasis on the inventory or the calculations, but every box in the checklist, the spreadsheet needs to be marked. Everything is very important. So we want to make sure that we document that what we did and the folks that are reviewing our work understand it. So, we just need evidence for the conformance of all the verification criteria, and we found that this really helps to facilitate a rapid review by the OPR and the ARB, and we are happy and proud to say that we've had reviews by the ARB with no questions, because we're like, that's good, we got it, we see that you've done everything, all the boxes are checked, and we agree with you. So that's part of the process that you guys don't see, but we do that to ensure a rapid review by the other folks that are reviewing us. Next slide. So how long does verification take? So like I alluded to this before, it's all about checking the box. And for us, it's just making sure that we can, do that quickly and efficiently and with assurance. So if you have a high quality and complete OPDR and all the supporting evidence, it makes perfect sense how you get from plot level carbon to RBUX. Fantastic. Other considerations are responding to findings. I know that sometimes they're tricky to respond to, or folks get involved on other projects, which leads to staff availability. I think especially during the summer months, it gets very constrained because people are on site visits, people take vacation. It's just really figuring out the schedule and sticking to it. Also, the unknown is the time spent by the OPR and the ARB reviewing the project. If anyone has any insights about the ARBQ, I'd be curious about that. I know that they have more staff and things are going through quicker, but that's something that we feel that our role is to be as efficient and timely as possible, so then it can just get to the next person. Next slide, please. So how much does verification cost? The answer is, again, time. How long does it take us to check those boxes? So things to consider are the previous experience of the project developer, accessibility, again, time in the field, getting there in helicopter or hiking for 4 hours is different if you have plots within 15 minutes to the road. Size is important in some ways, but it's not a multiplier. Location, spatial distribution of the project. And then really important is the quantification approach and how you are demonstrating, that data flow process. I say changes, I'm going to highlight changes here because I think we're talking about long-term management. So if you're changing the design or the inventory or the activities, it does take time for us to review those and to see if it's still in conformance and it meets the rules. Silviculture, again, that's management. The number of strata that you have, we've seen some really complicated projects with lots of strata that takes time to understand and agree with. And then the on-site is the number of trees per plot and the number of plots which can be remeasured in a day. Okay, next slide. So there's the carbon verification is not based on a per acre multiplier. Next slide. So the verification cycle, a full verification is required every 6 years and annual reports in the intervening years. It requires a change of the verification body and team, and this includes a site visit and sequential sampling. It could be done more frequently if you want to change from CC08s to CC03s. The cost is variable because it includes the sequential sampling. You could have you could pass the minimum number of plots, and it'll be less expensive than if you take 80 plots to pass, and that can happen, 80 plots per stratum even. So I just hazard a guess at the numbers because it's variable. And then could you click, please, Sarah? The next is the less intensive verifications, and that's when you have no change to the verification body, the inventory methodology, the confidence deduction, or the reversal risk rating. So that cost can be $5,000 to $14,000 per reporting period. Again, these are just ballparks. Next slide. So here's the CAPR, the keys to verification success. It's pretty simple, really. High technical quality. Folks that are competent, with experience, they have a complete OPDR and supporting documentation. The data that Jim was talking about, spreadsheets, databases, workflow documentation, all those things are super clear, easy to follow, people can replicate. There we go, clear, efficient quantification approach. The next is developing and maintaining a forest inventory of a high quality needed for carbon projects, which is what Jim spoke about. We definitely saw it's just a big change. I think we've been doing this for, about a dozen years now. Folks are not trying to use as often old inventories that were made for other purposes that may have only functioned or highlighted merchantable timber, which we see have been problematic. So one thing is we've seen for a lot of the initial projects, reporting periods, fresh inventories, and it'll be interesting to see how frequently folks update them and what that'll mean for verification time. Again, another key is budgeting adequately for verification, the time, the personnel, and just the expense. So it's just everything from the contracting to responding to findings to just, working with us to make sure we're on the same page. Next slide. So integrity, this is important because we've seen folks that are just trying to get through the verification process as, a little bit of like an annoyance. But if you really have the objective of developing a durable and correct project, then you're really going to, understand why we're asking questions, why we're looking for conformance to all these requirements, and we'll get through it a lot quicker. Another thing that we're seeing folks do more, but is important, is working closely with us, the verifier, as well as the OPR and ARB. If there's any questions or little strange things with your project, or you need guidance, let's do it early and often. We don't want to do that at the very end, and that we could have, changed the site visit or avoided problems, or it's going to affect your issuance. We want to make sure that we're doing things together, and we understand that sometimes ARB legal takes a while, or they just need to review things. It's not going to be instantaneous, and it may affect our established timelines. So clear and open communication and working together is key. Last slide. So thank you very much. Please let me know if you have any questions. We're definitely interested in supporting high quality verifications and just making sure our part of the process, keeps the whole market moving forward.
Great, thank you, Christie. It doesn't look like we have any new questions right now, so I'll go ahead and move on to our next speaker, John Battaglia, Senior Vice President and Head of Carbon Markets at BGC Partners. John, you on?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me? Everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, hold on one second, and I'm just stepping off my desk. I'll be right back. Okay, you guys have markers. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm an extra reserve and to all others on the call. Sorry, I'm kind of joining in haste a little bit. California carbon allowances have been very active today, so I've been involved in markets up until this moment. So I was asked today to join, so a little bit about myself and BGC. So BGC is a brokerage. We work in a variety of markets globally, financial markets, as well as a variety of commodity markets. We were spun off of Cantor Fitzgerald. Cantor Fitzgerald is a large institutional brokerage working in fixed income and equity markets. So I was asked today to kind of come on and talk a little bit about the carbon markets. I manage the carbon trading business here at BGC, and that includes all markets within the North American context. So that would include carbon offsets, of course, in California, allowances in the California market, RGGI in the Northeast, which is a power market-only carbon trading market, and then a variety of kind of provincial and state level markets as well, inclusive of LCFS, the low carbon fuel standard. So I'm going to kind of move along. I don't have the slides. I did step off the desk. Sarah, do I just kind of let you know if how I'm going to be moving through the slides?
Yeah, I'll follow along.
Is that okay? All right. So I'm going to kind of get right into the crux of it. So I'm moving along to the slide titled California Carbon Offsets, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th slide. So I don't know if this material has been covered. If it has, I could kind of move along to the market side of things. And the context for my discussion is primarily going to focus on California carbon offsets, as well as the allowance market and how the two products relate to one another as far as pricing goes in the marketplace. So CCOs come in a variety of different, I guess, kind of risk profiles is how I would characterize it, and the market prices it based on that risk. So the product that's issued by the Air Resources Board right out of the gates is the CCO 8, so it carries 8 years of invalidation risk. Project developers, whether it's in forestry, ODS, livestock, or any of the other qualified ARB protocols, can go through a subsequent verification to reduce the invalidation risk from 8 years down to 3 years. The invalidation risk begins on compliance offsets at the time at which the 8 is issued. So if you conduct a verification within 3 years of issuance, at the end of the 3-year period, you're going from a CCO, I guess, essentially 5 down to a CCO 0 at that point. So the invalidation risk starts to elapse the minute it gets issued by the Air Resources Board. Most compliance buyers in this market, with the exception of a few that are familiar with managing project level invalidation risk, are purchasing what are called golden CCOs, or CCOs that are not issued by ARB. All credits that are being bought and sold in the market have invalidation risk. It's just certain sellers with investment grade balance sheets, some are publicly traded, others are private, but have rated debt that is investment grade, are able to effectively credit wrap those offsets with invalidation risk and sell them contractually in the market as a golden offset. And what they're contractually agreeing to do is to replace any invalidated offsets. First, they will replace them with another golden offset or a guaranteed offset. And then in the event of a second invalidation event, they will replace them with what are called California carbon allowances. And so that's a fully credit backstopped product that's been de-risked of all the regulatory risks surrounding invalidation. And I know I'm kind of getting into the market side of what these products are. Sarah, has the reason for invalidation been covered on this webinar so far?
Yeah, we did go over those reasons.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to move to the next slide, the pricing slide. So the allowance market is probably, in terms of depth, the volume that's transacted on a daily basis, and the breadth in terms of the number of parties that are involved in the market, is a much bigger market than the offset market. California, up until this date, has auctioned billions of dollars worth of allowances into the market, and there are, I think at this point, billions of allowances that are in circulation as of today. There is a secondary market for allowances. So the primary market would be considered the auction market, which occurs on a quarterly basis. It's run by the Air Resources Board. And participants from end users, compliance, to speculators that are looking to take price risk in this market can participate on a quarterly basis. In addition to that, the secondary market is cleared through an exchange. The current exchange that holds the most liquidity and open interest would be the Intercontinental Exchange out of Chicago. They list futures contracts and other derivative contracts that transact and trade on the underlying product, which is a California carbon allowance. So there's a forward market for those. Forward being, you could take delivery of carbon instruments, carbon allowance instruments going out. Really, in today's market, there's open interest that goes out as far as December of 2021, which is just beyond the current compliance period that runs through December of through 2020 compliance emissions. So the current market structure for prices, June futures, which could be analogous to spot or immediate transfer allowances for vintage 2019, are trading before this webinar or as of earlier this morning, $17.48. Prices have dropped off today precipitously to about $17.15, as there's been a fair amount of selling activity in today's market. So we've probably dropped about 30 cents or so, which compared to, wheat, corn, oil, natural gas may not seem like a great deal, but given the historical volatility of allowances, that's actually a pretty relatively decent sized move. So what's been kind of driving some of the selling activity today is it seems like some traders that maybe bought more than they wanted at the recent auction that was in May and are turning around and maybe being forced to sell by internal risk managers that are forcing them to liquidate some of their positions. So that's been putting a lot of downward pressure on prices today. Then we go out to the December futures. December futures before were trading at about 1784. Those have fallen off today to about 1750. Hold on one second. And then we can kind of go out to December 20. The structure of this market largely has traded fundamentally off of an oversupplied market. So this year, the floor on allowances, and when I say the floor, I mean the floor for the auctions on where they can clear, a minimum price at which the quarterly auctions can clear is $15.62. So I'll go through this on the next graph. We don't have to go to it quite yet, Sarah, but what we've seen is a price in the secondary market, which is largely kind of grinding up very slowly with a slow escalating price signal on carbon by the cost of inflation. So that would be, there's a 5% escalator each year that's built into the floor, plus the cost of inflation, which goes up every year. That is sort of the minimum price the auctions can clear at. And so we've seen that historically sort of grind up. And the reason that we've largely stayed affixed to the floor is because of an oversupply in allowances in the marketplace. So I think directionally, most analysts are forecasting about current oversupply of about 100 million allowances. And that's expected to grow to as many as 150 or maybe even 175 million by 2026. So that essentially means is that the cap that's been set by California, those permits in aggregate exceed actual emissions through 2026 by about 150 million tons. And so because the market is awash in allowances, there's really been no need for the market to really trade above the floor. But 2019, we've seen a bit of a departure from that sort of parameter in which the market is traded, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Gold and CCO prices, today we're trading, I just traded December delivery 2019 at $14.85, and we're seeing prices tick up on the CCOs as well. Going to the next graph, Sarah. So this should be the one entitled Historical Price Spot CCA versus the Auction Clearing Price. So the first, if you can click on it, I think there's a couple of circles that'll come up. The first one is on the left side of the graph. At the outset of this market, prices were trading around $14 a metric ton. Sorry, was there a question? Are we taking questions during the presentation, or is it all at the end?
We'll get questions at the end. I was just confirming if the circle came up.
Oh, okay, very good. So we started trading the market kind of in the 2013 timeframe. That's when the first year of emission obligations started. Around 14, ARB had come in and it essentially introduced a whole new set of regulatory amendments, which doled out free allowances to a lot of the industrials in greater amounts. And also some of the analysts had forecasted at this point an oversupply in the market very early on. And so prices sold off pretty considerably. And you could kind of see between 2014 and 2016, we traded more or less at the floor. That red line that escalates year over year is the floor price escalating each year. And the blue dots are actually the auction clearing prices, the quarterly auctions that ARB is holding. That black line is the secondary market price for spot CCAs. So that kind of compares the spot secondary market price to the auction floor, and then also to the auction clearing prices. And you could kind of see between 2014 and 2016, they were more or less around the floor. 2016, if you hit the next button, was a very interesting year. We had a bit of a sell-off. So I think the important point here is to mention quarterly auctions can't clear below that floor, but the secondary market price can trade below that floor. There's no rule that states that allowance prices cannot trade below the auction floor price. So what we saw was similar to today's situation, but a much graver situation, a situation in which traders needed to liquidate large positions of allowances. And that was a situation in which the allowance price dropped below the auction clearing price floor for a brief period of time during 2016. It represented a great opportunity for compliance buyers to buy allowances cheaper than where the state of California was selling them at the time in the auctions. And so there was a fair amount of trading activity below the auction price floor in 2016. That was precipitated in large part by concerns around a lawsuit, an auction lawsuit at the time, against the Air Resources Board, which ultimately was resolved by 2017. And in 2017, also, if you go to the next circle, the third one to the right, ARB, or actually the California legislature had adopted AB 398, which extended cap and trade to 2030. And so there was a big rally in the market. And then what we see, going to the fourth circle, if you hit that, Sarah, is a real kind of almost parabolic jump in the allowance price, just over a short 2 to 3 month period in the beginning of 2019. The recent rally and the rise above this, very material rise above the price floor since the start of this year has been driven by new kind of interested parties in the allowance market. What we saw in the course of 2018 was almost a 200% increase in European allowance prices, which is unrelated to CCAs, of course, but it was one of the best performing returns or sectors in the European market. And what we've started to see is some speculators that had looked at the European market starting to look at the California market as another potential market in which to speculate. So that increase, speculative interest that we've seen increase, coupled with the fact that there hasn't been a lot of sellers that have been willing to sell, has led to a rapid price increase in the California market over the course of this year. And we've seen, as I had mentioned earlier, kind of a reversing of that trend over the course of the last couple of weeks, as prices have sort of fallen off quite a bit. I'll go to the next price graph and kind of explain the historical relationship between the allowance and offsets. How am I doing on time, Sarah?
You're fine.
Okay. So this is a historical graph that kind of looks at the dollar differential between the CCA price and the various offset products that were mentioned earlier. So the gray line at the bottom is the golden CCO, and so that's the whole dollar discount from CCA to golden CCO. And then the next product is a CCO3 and the next product CCO8. So this looks back to January of 2013. And it looks at the difference in the various products as they relate to the CCA. So you can kind of see, looking from left to right, from 2013 to 2016, kind of a tightening of the spread, or a narrowing in the dollar differential between the various offset products and the allowance. The reason you see that in particular around January of 2016 is because November 1st of 2015 was the first compliance surrender for 2013 and 2014 emission obligations. So what we've seen is compliance buyers that are covering their 8% offset obligation kind of waiting to the last minute, so to speak, to kind of come in and cover their offset obligations. And so leading up to November of 2015 and even beyond, we saw a tightening in the spread between the offsets and the allowances. 2016, you see spreads widen quite a bit. That happened to coincide with that sell-off in the CCAs below the price floor. So that was a bit of a shock to the market. And also it was a post-compliance period. So there was very limited demand in offset markets. And so the spreads tend to widen. And then leading up to November of 2018, again, you see a big tightening again. And so that was when the 2015 to 2017 or CP2 emission obligations were due in November of 2018. And since then, we've seen a widening of the spread. So that kind of gives you a sense of the historical relationships and around when the spreads are tightest between the allowance product and the offset product, and why. So the next slide is a historical graph looking at the differential between the golden CCO and the CCO3. I guess the takeaway is just looking at the right side of the graph. You could see the differential between the golden and the CCO3 product has narrowed quite a bit. We've on certain days traded CCO3s almost flat to what the goldens have traded. I mean, historically, the spread has been probably closer to $1 to $1.50. And as of, the last, I would say the last 6 months or so, maybe even a little bit longer, we've seen, almost, probably an average of closer to 50 cents. And that could be because the market is, pricing invalidation risk a little differently than it has in the past. I think it's probably been mentioned that only roughly 85,000 offsets have been invalidated of, I don't know what's been issued, 120 million or so. So you could see that it's a very low amount of offsets that have been invalidated in the overall pool. So maybe perhaps the market is pricing the invalidation risk as being de minimis, and so the market is willing to pay for CCO3s very close to what the golden CCO value is trading at. The next slide is the CCA market outlook slide. As I had mentioned, there's broader speculative interest in CCA futures. And another thing to kind of keep an eye on, that informs the forward curve for allowances. One, of course, is inflation and how inflation in the economy is escalating year after year, because that will affect the floor for allowances. But also the interest rate environment is also important. The Fed is forecasting 2 rate cuts potentially this year, and so the yield curve, which has actually become inverted at certain times, is kind of indicating cheaper interest rates and borrowing costs. And so the forward curve for allowances often prices off what's happening in the interest rate market as well. So lower interest rates could mean a lower forward price curve actually, as opposed to steepening. So that's kind of an economic indicator that has been changing recently. And then as far as the fundamentals of this market, we would, certainly forecast an oversupply to be continued through 2026. So fundamentally, this market is going to remain oversupplied for quite some time unless AIRB intervenes to do something, which there is some escalating political, I think, pressure to take a look at that. It doesn't sound like anything will change in terms of the overall supply for the market, but that's something that that the market is looking very closely at. And then, you know, next year we're forecasting a floor price in 2020 of 1671. This year, as I mentioned, 1562. So, as you know, expecting, excuse me, about 2% CPI for next year. So the next slide.
John, actually, before we go on to the next slide, I think now might be a good time to take a couple of questions since they're related to this slide on market outlook. We got a question related to basically how do you think Oregon's potential entry into the market would affect oversupply, and also how do you think a recession might impact this market?
Hold on one moment. I gotta take a sip. I got a bit of a cold and a bit of a scratch in my throat. Hold on. So the introduction of Oregon to the market, I don't think is going to have a material effect. My understanding is the overall cap that's been discussed is around 60 million tons. This oversupply is well in excess of 100 million likely by the time Oregon joins. And I think that the cap that's going to be set, as well as the supply that's associated with emissions, will be relatively flat. So maybe they'll forecast, you know, or they'll end up sort of employing a cap that's relatively flat, or maybe slightly in excess of actual emissions. And so net, I don't think that that Oregon's participation is going to make a great deal of impact on prices in the short run, frankly. Similar to how Ontario didn't really make much of an impact. And frankly, Ontario is much larger of a cap than Oregon. And then the second part of the question was related to a recession. A recession, you know, would obviously indicate a declining interest rate environment. A declining interest rate environment, I think, would probably drag down the forward curve. It could also, you know, change the ability for speculators to speculate, and that is really, I think, where the downside risk is to the market. It's really not related to the fundamentals per se, or the supply demand of the market, or the regulatory certainty of this market and the outlook associated with it. It's really related to the traders' books and to some extent, and how they react to a recession. You know, if large traders with large balances of the supply are required to sell, that obviously puts a lot of downward pressure on price. Coupled with that, I think a lower interest rate environment could lead to lower, you know, a lower forward price curve. You know, which would weigh, of course, on the CCOs. CCOs are pricing very significantly off what's happening in the CCA market. People often price CCOs as a percentage of the CCA. They certainly price the golden as a percentage of the CCA, and then the gold, or the CCO3 and CCO8s, are often priced against the golden product. So all of that, you know, backdrop is affected by recession, and so I don't know if that helps answer your question, but hopefully it gives some color around what we're thinking.
Great, thanks. And then also, can you talk a little bit about how changes in 2021 are expected to impact offset prices, with things like the percentage changing?
Yeah, so DEBs versus non-DEBs. I mean, the conventional thought by the market is that DEBs projects, as you know, the market, I think, understands them to be, will be, of course, in state, and then maybe some forest projects with watershed boundaries or other sort of boundaries within the state of California, and potentially, you know, ODS, where some of the materials arrive from California. I think, you know, that is largely probably the bucket that I think the market believes DEBs to be, or the potential for it to be, maybe with some outliers around that. But I think the conventional thought is that DEBs will be undersupplied, and non-DEBs will be oversupplied. And so, you know, as of right now, there's not a big differential between, I mean, the market trading and pricing golden CC03 and CC08. At some point, probably, I would think towards next year, as we're approaching the post-2020 market, the market will start pricing DEB versus non-DEBs. As of right now, ARB, I don't believe, has allowed developers or any market participant to designate an offset through its serial tag as DEB or non-DEB, and so you can't exactly transfer a DEB product in the market physically today. But I think over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, people will start pricing those separately, and I would expect that DEB products, and I think the market believes this, will price premium to non-DEB products. In terms of overall market pricing for CCOs, I would expect that DEBs closely track golden products, and depending on the severity of the oversupply, you could see non-DEB products trade at a discount to the DEB product and the golden product. Exactly what that will look like is very difficult to tell. A few dynamics that inform offset pricing is, issuance delays. So ARB has been delayed in certain issuance, project issuances, and that has affected market pricing dramatically. And so, things like issuance delays and also how the market adjusts supply-wise to the constraints in demand due to the reduction in the quantitative limit, is yet to be determined on how that'll affect pricing.
Great, thanks. And move on to your last couple of slides to wrap up here.
Yeah, so I just wanted to explain a little bit more about what we do and how we interact with the marketplace. So one of the things that I think is, I've gone through a couple of slides, frankly, that are quite proprietary to what we do. There's very limited price information in offset markets. It's a fairly opaque market. It's not tracked like an exchange is, and there's no depth and liquidity that's, kind of conferred to the market on a daily basis. And so being an active broker in the offset market, we provide price discovery and liquidity in an otherwise relatively opaque market. Market color and competitive trade execution, what that means is, what is the flow of trading? Is it speculative interest coming in on the CCAs? What's driving prices to the upside? Are CCO markets following that? If they are, why? If they're not, why? Excuse me. So that's good market color that we provide to our customers. And then good trade execution, good price discovery and trade execution. Knowledge of policy in the post-2020 market, I think, is vital to understanding the value of the product that you're producing. So we closely cover policy developments, regulatory developments, whether it's external to California or internal to California, and provide that color to customers on a regular basis. Anonymity. So a lot of folks don't like to show up in the market and say, I've got 1 million offsets to sell. What is your price market? And so that could scare some buyers off in a liquid market. And so hiding volume and hiding name from market provides value and could help to get better trade execution, frankly, and price discovery. And then just strategies around trading and risk management. And then an important thing is we don't actually take principal positions. So we're providing liquidity to the marketplace and trade execution without actually trading a book ourselves, which gives us some form of neutrality in the market. And then the next slide is just a fun slide. It kind of shows the trading floor. It can be quite hectic at times, but it's what we do. And I think largely that probably covers most of, and we also think that there's a slide on some of the reports that we put out. We put out reports on a daily basis with prices for various products that we're actively transacting and providing market color and liquidity on. So I think that kind of covers most of what I wanted to talk about, Sarah. I don't know if that fits within the scope of what we were trying to cover. and I know it was a lot of information, so I apologize if it was dense.
That was great. Thank you, John. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I realize that we are running up against the end of our time here, so I won't dwell too long on conclusions. I guess just one last point that I wanted to make before we wrap things up. On the voluntary market, we're in the process of updating our voluntary forest protocol, and we are keeping a lot of these challenges in mind in terms of the updates we're making to try to address some of the questions and concerns that come up related to long-term forest management and market considerations. So if you have a chance, I would definitely encourage you to take a look at our draft protocol. It's currently out for public comment until July 12th. But with that, thank you all for joining us. I have our speaker contact information here. If you have any questions that we weren't able to get to in this time, please feel free to reach out to any of our speakers with those questions. And we will also be posting a recording and PDF of today's slides. So thanks everyone for joining.